priority scheme, Stella, because you wanted to raise...
Chicken.
Well, hang on.
I want British farmers and British business to be able to sell into Europe.
Well, we're going to talk to someone from the...
chlorinated chicken and an increase of trade in our local markets, which is, as I say, 41% of all our exports go to the EU. I know which wins for British businesses. I know which wins for British farmers.
All right.
I know which wins for the British
Well, we're
public
going to talk to someone from the fishing industry in...
A new day and a new Brexit reset. Some changes are on the horizon. We have an agreement with the EU that we will agree to align to their regulations. And the Brexiteers are wailing, and they don't like it because they say we're surrendering ourselves. But actually, the truth of the matter is, aligning to EU regulations is confirming that we won't allow our standards of imports to drop below the very high standards in the European Union. And the reason they're wailing is because they want the American trade deal, which means surrendering our sovereignty to allow our standards to drop to American standards, which are low, some of the lowest in the world. And that is why they're moaning, because Brexit was always about getting an American trade deal. And now it seems the Labour government are hitching us to Europe, to the EU, so that we cannot trade away our standards. And that is good news. It's a relief as long as that does happen, and we'll have to watch what happens with the other trade deals and what they deliver. But ultimately, dynamically aligning to EU regulations, getting an SPS agreement, gives us an assurance that our standards won't drop. And that is good news. And really, with gravity, it will mean that we are likely to get back closer to our biggest market, and trade with our biggest market will probably start to increase once that deal is in place. But here's the rub. David Hennig reckons it will take a decade to get this agreement, the SPS agreement, working. And that is depressing. The reason for that is our borders are not fit for purpose. And to manage an SPS agreement, we have to be able to manage our borders. It was always the case that it's a lot easier to rejoin the Single Market and Customs Union than to implement an SPS agreement. But it is good to see that we have made some progress and some improvements, but it is depressing that the political cost of that is really playing out the same as if Keir Starmer had dropped all the red lines and joined the Single Market and Customs Union, which he might as well have done, and then our economy would have been so much better off, and also our food standards would be so much better off, our food security, energy security, and all the rest of it.
Is this a return to the Brexit wars?
I certainly hope not, because I think the British public can see very clearly now the damage that the Brexit that we had negotiated has done. They've seen the increase in the cost of food. They've seen the businesses who've just given up because there's so much paperwork. They've seen the risk that it presents to our status on the international stage, and particularly when it comes to things like working together to tackle the impact of Putin and energy costs. None of us want to go back to the division of the referendum. I sit here, chair of the Labour Movement for Europe. I'm not here sitting calling for rejoin. I wanted us to have a salvage operation. It looks to me like for the 16,000 businesses who've just given up trading, there's going to be a lot in here to welcome, particularly that reduction in paperwork.
Mel, is it a return to the Brexit wars? We have seen there and heard from colleagues of yours the sort of language that was reminiscent of those years post-2016, surrender, betrayal.
So nobody wants to see division. That's absolutely the case. And as with Stella, we both sort of went through that period in Parliament. It was deeply...
We're triggered.
Deeply difficult. But look, the question is this a good deal? And does it respect the fact that we voted ultimately to leave the European Union? I think on things like dynamic alignment and taking rules from Brussels and maybe paying money to Brussels, we're yet to see, and the deal on fish, I'm not convinced at this stage of the day, and we'll find out a bit more in a moment, that deal does respect the result of the referendum in that way. And I think that could be problematic.
Did this deal change the political fortunes for Keir Starmer?
Well, I think the Labour Party, the number one thing it has to deliver in order to change its political fortunes is growth. The next election will be mostly about the economy and whether people are feeling better off. And for me, this language of betrayal, surrender, it is childish hyperbole. We've got a growth issue in this country. We've seen growth lag for the last 20 years. We've seen living standards stagnate. We need economic growth. Trade deals with your closest neighbours are one way to deliver that growth. And the idea that you're not going to make a trade agreement and there be compromises on both sides, it's completely childish and it's lying to the British public. And I think the British public have had enough lies from people like the Conservative Party who say, oh, we can leave the EU and we can have it all and we won't be economically worse off. We are worse off as a result. We need to make some compromises. That's what the government's doing. And quite frankly, I think the public are going to be OK with that.
Well, we've
had anemic growth and stagnant living standards in this country since 2008.
But the OBR halved the growth rate.
Since the financial crisis.
Under your watch.
I don't represent the Labour Party.
All right, fair enough. Under Labour's
but we have had these anemic growth rates for the last 20 years. You can't blame that on 10 months of a Labour government. Your Conservative government has got a lot to answer for on that. When it comes to trade barriers, when you've got stagnant growth, and that was basically down to too low levels of business investment in this country over the last 30 to 40 years compared to some of our neighbours, the very last thing you do is erect trade barriers that have a big impact on exporting businesses. That's exactly what Boris Johnson decided to do by going for a very hard Brexit. That has had an impact on growth. It's not the only reason for low growth, but it is certainly true that growth, we'd be doing better growth, we'd be doing better on exports if we had not erected these trading barriers.
But equally, it's not fair to say that slow growth is not the fault of this government. The IMF, the World Bank, the OBR, they're all down there.
It's not a 10-month problem. It's a 20-year problem.
Let's talk about some cold hard facts about this, Mel, because under the deal that your government negotiated, exports plummeted by a third to Europe. Right now, we sell more to Europe than we do combined India, America, Indo-Pacific. You can fight many things in life, Mel. You can't fight geography. It really matters for British businesses to start reducing those barriers, including the whacking charges that your government introduced on the border to get things across the border. The amount of paperwork. Go down to Sevington. I think you will apologise to everybody who works in the logistics industry in this country. If this deal reduces or indeed eliminates the export health certificates, the paperwork that people have gone, that can only be good for growth. Well, let's talk about youth mobility.
Well, hang on, let Mel come back on that, because I want to also refer to this. I think it was from 2022, when you yourself admitted Brexit created frictions in trade, says Work and Pensions Secretary Mel Stride. So you must welcome frictionless, certainly.
No, the one doesn't necessarily follow from the other. And to Stella's point, the fact of the matter is dynamic alignment in this arrangement, which means rule-taking from Brussels without incidentally having a seat at the table to make the rules. Hold on. Does mean that when it comes to free trade agreements with other parts of the world, and we did the deal with the CPTPP, a very fast-growing area market, it makes it much, much harder if your hands are tied by having to follow EU rules. That was part of the rationale of stepping back from it.
Your government's obsession with being friend of Europe meant you didn't even want to know if there was foot and mouth in France. You didn't even want to be part of the biosecurity alert.
Well, let him finish his point and I'll come back to you.
Finish my point. Nobody is saying that we shouldn't be reducing frictions in trade. Of course we should. We should do that with.
And do you admit that will happen?
To have ended up, as it appears to be the case, as a rule taker, subject to the European Court, the ECJ, etc., to end up as a rule taker is not going to help us.
Well, we're going to get the detail on that, but
in parts of the world that are growing faster than Europe.
You signed up to the ECJ as well. After all, it's the ECJ that the panel looking at the thing about sand eels adhered to. So you were already part of this. This is all for the birds. Mel, the point is it going to make it easier for British businesses to trade because we're reducing the paperwork? Are you really telling me that a small deal with South Korea, which we've kept about pork markets, which I believe your previous Prime Minister Liz Truss thought was going to somehow resolve the billions of extra pounds that British businesses have had to pay in paperwork, the fact that 16,000 businesses have given up trading altogether? Are you really saying they are a price worth paying?
The parts of the world that are really expanding and the markets that we want to get a slice of.
He wants to fight geography. Can we talk about youth mobility?
Hang on.
In the global world, you can trade all around the world, and the CPTPP deal was part of that. We did 73 different free trade agreements. And what drives that is the ability to do deals where you have control.
Hang on.
I've listened to him at length.
No, because I'm going to interject here on the issue of dynamic alignment, because it probably doesn't mean an awful lot to some of our viewers. And that is this idea that if rules are changed in the future, because we're not part of the EU and we chose to leave the European Union, we will not have a say in those changes, and rules could be made that could disadvantage us. Do you accept that that was a trade-off? It was a trade-off and a compromise.
About dynamic alignment.
Well,
and this is the previous government wanted to rip up every single regulation.
Now,
I'm sorry, because this is a.
No, but Stella, that's not the question I'm asking.
I
want you to answer the question about the trade-offs. Now, we've heard about removing trade barriers, and Mel Stry's had to answer that, and I want you to answer the trade-off is that we will not be at the table when they change the rules.
Because I know that the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill is going through Parliament, which is the foundation of all of this, which is not about the same as alignment. You're talking about dynamic alignment, which is about a default, isn't it? And frankly, the previous government wanted us to have separate regulations about aeroplanes, as if the idea that a plane taking off in London would have to follow different rules to a plane taking off in Berlin and landing and vice versa. The previous government tried to do separate regulatory regimes and in the end gave up and said that if we'd followed European regulations, UK regulations were set. The reality about this is businesses want to be able to trade. That means they follow common rule books. It makes common sense to people. That doesn't mean that we won't be able to vary if it's in the national interest. That's why this is a good deal. What we've seen because of Brexit is more paperwork, more cost, more non-tariff barriers. What you're talking about, when we talk about dynamic regulation, we're talking about a shared set of rules. British business has spoken. British business did not want the separate charter mark regime that the previous government tried to bring in. So the last government had to row back from this madness. It's about time we had some common sense about this.
But it's all fits that have been raised, if they come, will be in cheaper bills. If food is perhaps cheaper in the supermarkets, if that happens, then there will be a boost to Keir Starmer. But we don't know, do we? Well, all right, hang on. Yes.
It was interest to me. So, look, there are, of course, trade-offs, right? We live in a global world. We want to trade with other nations. There are trade-offs with sovereignty and being able to do exactly what you want in every single of your own markets. The whole point of dynamic alignment means it reduces that bureaucracy around trading, because if you are going along with the EU's regulatory standards, it makes trade much more flexible and fluid and dynamic. So it's a trade-off for us. Yes, we can say we're not doing your thing, we're not going to follow you. In fact, that's what the last government did. We didn't really make any use of that.
Well, I was just about to say, why didn't you diverge more? Why didn't you diverge more if it was such a big thing?
But let's just be honest about those trade-offs. And Stella is right. There are lots of businesses who want this. And I didn't see any democratic sort of demand from the public to say, well, actually, we want to be poorer by not following the EU standards. When have we had that conversation?
Well, Mel, what about...